defending its citizens or asserting its dominance on the global stage. President Vladimir Putin defends military intervention in Ukraine, but is Russia's response part of a broader international ambition? This is Inside Story. Russian President Vladimir Putin has been spelling out his position on the crisis in Ukraine and standing firm on the need to use force if it becomes necessary. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. President Putin has told a news conference that the ousting of Ukrainian leader Viktor Yanukovych was an unconstitutional coup and an armed seizure of power. Even so, he said force would only be used by Russia as a last resort. In a measured first response to the crisis, Putin warned that any sanctions against Russia would backfire and any threats would be counterproductive and harmful.
The
definition of what's happened in Kiev and in Ukraine as a whole, the definition could be the only one. It's an unconstitutional coup and a military seizure of power. Nobody's arguing with that. We believe Ukraine is not only our closest neighbor, but is indeed our brotherly republic. And our armed forces are brothers in arms, friends. Many of them know each other personally. And I'm confident that Ukrainian soldiers and Russian soldiers won't be on the opposing sides of the barricades. If we see that lawlessness is starting in eastern regions too, if people ask us for help, and we've already an official address from the current legitimate president, we reserve the right to use all options at our disposal to protect those citizens.
Well, while there's been all action and not a lot of talk until now from Russia, it's been all talk and little action from the West. The US was quick to warn there would be costs for any Russian military intervention, later accusing Russia of violating Ukraine's sovereignty. But measures to curb Russia's perceived aggression have so far been limited. The US has suspended all military engagements with Russia. It has frozen trade and investment talks and halted preparations for the G8 summit of Western powers due to be hosted by Russia in Sochi in June. But as EU partners considered putting pressure on Moscow, leaked documents appeared to show some reluctance from Britain. It said Britain should not support for now trade sanctions or close London's financial centre to Russians, underlining the complex economic ties with Russia. Well, let's bring in our guests. In Moscow, Vyacheslav Matuzov, a political commentator and a former Russian diplomat in Washington. In our London studios, we have Ben Judah, visiting fellow at the European Stability Initiative and author of the book Fragile Empire: How Russia Fell In and Out of Love with Vladimir Putin. And joining us from New York is Peter Zalmayev, director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative, which seeks to promote understanding of the former Soviet region in the West. Let's begin in Moscow with Vyacheslav Matuzov. We have heard President Putin portray it as a humanitarian mission. The US Secretary of State John Kerry describes it as a brazen act of aggression. How do you view the Crimean operation?
I watched very attentively and very closely all developments in Maidan in Kiev, all 3 months. And I have my own impression of what was going on. First of all, I was surprised a great role that played in inspiration of Maidani people by American politicians, European parliamentarians, and even official faces from Baltic states. And I can say that I have an impression they were encouraging opposition manifestation to give more efforts to overthrow an existed in Ukraine regime, Viktor Yanukovych. I agree with all those who say that this regime was not good, that was corrupted, that was involved in many criminal schemes. But They were officially and legally elected rulers. I was surprised when people coming from outside, participating in opposition meetings and demanding changing this existing regime in this country. Even State Department person Victoria Nuland and the ambassador of the US in Kiev were exchanging telephones and walking on between
if I may, apologies for interrupting you, Vyacheslav.
It was a surprising
but I want to pick up on that issue of the US position a little bit later. But for now, I just want to go to Ben Judah in London and see his feeling. Is this an act of aggression or is it a humanitarian mission as President Putin would have it?
From Putin's point of view, Ukraine has never truly been an independent country. When the Soviet Union dissolved, Russian officials and Russian diplomats presumed that the empire had been converted into a cheap sphere of influence, and these states would sort of stay there, stay in their place. So imagine that if Scotland becomes independent of Great Britain, the English elite might assume that Scotland would just sort of stay there. And for Mr. Putin, what he's watched over the past decade with Western Ukrainian elites and Kiev trying to move away from Russia and towards the European Union and towards NATO, he views as existentially threatening to Russia's identity as a great power. Putin believes that Russia, that has a sphere of influence around it, is a great state, is sort of noble of the name of Russia. Russia that has no sphere of influence around it, which has no client states, is merely a big state. And he believes that that would be the end of Russia's identity, which it's had for millennia. So he thinks he's defending something, and he's defending what is Russia's natural right in these territories.
Well, Peter Zamayev in New York, your view?
Well, I agree with Ben, first of all, that Russia has had a very hard time ever since the breakup of the Soviet Union recognizing the sovereignty of Ukraine, specifically the sovereignty of Ukraine over the Crimean Peninsula, which is now under the occupation of the Russian military. There is a serious and a massive disinformation campaign being waged in Russian media about the true state of affairs in Ukraine. There have been media reports about hundreds of thousands of Russian ethnic Russians fleeing Ukraine for Russia, which is not just an exaggeration, but apparently an outright falsification. We also have reports of busloads of activists from arriving in Ukraine, in eastern towns of Ukraine and in the Crimea from Russia in order to stir up trouble, in order to put on these displays of solidarity with Moscow, asking for Moscow's intervention. So there is a very serious and well-coordinated effort, apparently afoot, in Ukraine to create an impression, at least with the Russian public, that there is a legitimate concern with the safety of the Russian speakers in Ukraine. As a Russian, as an ethnic Russian from the east of Ukraine, as a Ukrainian American, I can say that while there have been issues in the past in Ukraine with the Russian language, it has been a thorny issue. This is an eternal matter for Ukraine. It has been resolved before by Ukrainians. It remains an internal issue for Ukrainians and only Ukrainians to solve. I believe that it was misguided.
Let's just, if I may, Peter, let's just put what you said there to Vyacheslav Matuzov, the allegation there that this is a concocted event, that the reaction of Russians within the Ukraine or native Russians within the Ukraine is not spontaneous. It's part of some kind of plot. Is the assertion there your view of that?
I can say that corruption was absolutely clear, was one of the features of Yanukovych regime, but he was a legally elected president. A surprise. Why people who came to demonstrate their resistance to corruption were joined by absolutely unaccepted groups, militarized, with weapons, and good trained. Russia had a very documented examples that some of them were trained in Poland and Baltic states and came to Ukraine from to Kiev from western regions of Ukraine. We know very well what it means, Western Ukraine. It is the motherland of Galician SS division that was during the Second World War fighting on the side of Hitler against Soviet army. Until 1955, there were battles with them in that rest of them in Carpat mountains. We know that very well. We are Russians. And after that, we found them as a driving force of organized, trained and militarized, and Yanukovych gave an order not to shoot.
But if I may, Vyacheslav Matuzov, if you mentioned a bit of history there, but Russia actually gave Crimea to the Ukraine in 1954, about the time you were recounting those events. So the territory was ceded.
That's right. That's right, because Nikita Khrushchev, while after Stalin's death, was trying to bring Ukrainian political bureau of Ukrainian Communist Party leadership on his side. He was originally from Donetsk, Nikita Khrushchev. He was Ukrainian origin. And he was trying to drive Ukrainian leadership to his side in his struggle against groups in Moscow with Politburo to gain the power. And he received it. And as a thankful position, he gave to Ukraine Crimea. But you remember that Sevastopol, a military city, never been a part of Crimea area. He was directly from Moscow ruled, governed, because it was military base and it was not responsible to Ukrainian authorities. He was responsible to Moscow exactly, and that's why when it was Crimea was joined, nobody told to Khrushchev that Crimea and Sevastopol is the same picture.
But if I may just go to Peter, apologies for interrupting you, but if I may go to Peter Zalmayev on that particular point that you make there, that Russia has some kind of historical claim to the Crimea, which it is exercising now in terms of this operation. What's your view of that?
Well, my view is that ever since the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine has been recognized in its current borders, including Crimea, as a sovereign state. So no matter what deep down inside Russian politicians have thought about the Crimea and its true owner, for the last 2 decades, the official position of the Russian government has been to recognize Ukraine as a sovereign state in its present borders. So the military incursion that we're witnessing right now is a violation of Ukraine's sovereignty.
Well, let's just pick up on a particular point that Vyacheslav Matuzov made a little bit earlier, right at the beginning, and I want to put it to you, Ben Judah. We heard from President Putin that there are double standards. He pointed out in his news conference that the US, for example, acted in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, either without UN resolutions or twisting UN resolutions, as he puts it. He is arguing that Russia is acting in exactly the same way, and yet it gets criticized while countries like the US does not. Is there a bias, a particularly Western bias against Russian action?
I think the most important thing to understand about how Vladimir Putin sees the West right now is that Vladimir Putin knows how Russian corruption works. Russian corruption works like this. Billions and billions and billions of dollars are stolen from Russian state companies and Russian budgets. Where do they go? They don't go to Russia, they don't go to China, they don't go to the Gulf. The money comes to London. The money goes to Geneva. The money goes to French chateaus. It goes to Austrian bank accounts. Who are the people bringing this money in? These are Western elites. It's British bankers, it's French bankers, it's German accountants, it's Italian lawyers, and this money is being invested in the Western economy and is the only way in an era of low growth that Western elites are making cash. In Britain, our Prime Minister David Cameron says Britain is open for business. Even though that sounds lovely, what in practice that means is that London's centre is being sold off to Russian oligarchs, British football teams are being sold off to Russian oligarchs, and the City of London is opening itself up to giant Russian state corporations' investment. Putin believes that he has the West down to a T. He believes that the West is a hypocrite and that Britain, France and Germany, contemporary Western Europe, has the morality of a hedge fund. It may talk about anti-corruption, but all it really wants to do is get the money and take it offshore. When Putin looks at Brussels, when Putin looks at Britain, and in particular at London, he sees a country that issues these empty statements about anti-corruption and how it deplores human rights, but he knows perfectly well where Russian dirty money goes. It goes to Britain's empire of tax havens over which the sun never sets, from Gibraltar to the British Virgin Islands.
Well, let's just pause at this particular point and look at more detail into this area of perceived weakness. Now, while US President Barack Obama has been preoccupied with pulling troops out of areas of conflict and the EU has appeared increasingly fragmented, Russia has been carefully extending its influence abroad. In 2008, it went to war with Georgia over two breakaway regions. South Ossetia and Abkhazia are now virtual sections of Russia. Russia has also been repositioning itself strategically, regarded by its allies as a symbol of resistance against the West. It's becoming an influential member of the negotiating team with Iran, a pivotal player on Syria, using its UN veto to thwart resolutions against Bashar al-Assad's government. And President Putin has backed the presidential bid by Egypt's military leader, Field Marshal Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, something Barack Obama has yet to do. Now, looking at all of this, and I'll come back to you, Benjuda, can we look at Crimea in isolation, or is it perhaps part of a wider Russian strategy at a time where it perceives, as you've just mentioned, weaknesses in what in the past were its enemies?
Vladimir Putin thinks that the Western elite is the weakest Western elite since the 1930s. He thinks that David Cameron is pathetic. He thinks that François Hollande in France is pathetic. He thinks that Angela Merkel in Germany is pathetic. And he views Barack Obama as more think tanker than leader. Putin has been slowly moving to provoke the West on all of the fronts that you've mentioned. There have been provocations in Syria. There have been provocations over Edward Snowden. And Putin knows where his weakness is. He knows where his vulnerability is. The only thing that can hurt Putin is the money. And all of that money is in Western Europe. Let's be clear about one thing. In the 21st century, banks are more important than tanks. And the only thing that can stop Putin would be American and European sanctions on the financial services that they offer, impacting on the companies that keep the Russian state going and clamping down on Russian corruption. But because Putin thinks the Western elite is enthralled to hedge funders and investment bankers, is a Western elite that dreams of nothing more than making a profit in emerging markets and hiding the money in the British Virgin Islands. He thinks that nobody will stop him. Like, what this war, and it is a war, is about proving that Russia can act without consequences in any of the territories of the former Soviet Union.
Well, let's just go then. Let's just go then, if I may, to Vyacheslav Matuzov on this particular issue. Is there a wider foreign policy initiative evolving under President Putin, of which the Crimea is just a part, and in fact the latest in a series of steps where President Putin has been enlarging Russia's sphere of influence?
Well, I think it is great mistakes of US analytics and politicians when they are thinking that Russia should be in the first class in the school, and that they can, as a teachers, punish. To make some punishment for Russia and to teach how to behave on international scene. I think that is a great mistake, because Russia is a partner of the United States, but not as a pure boy in the first stage of the school, secondary school. I think it should be another approach to the issue. They mentioned Syria, they mentioned Middle East, maybe Egypt, Russian stance towards Egyptian development, Syrian development, Iran development. So, and now in Ukraine, and Edward Snowden. Please, Russia has their own view. Russia has own position. And it shouldn't follow instructions from White House, from State Department. They should understand motivation of Russian position in towards Egyptian regime, towards Syrian regime, towards Ukrainian regime. Understand why Russia behaves in such way in Ukraine.
Well, let's just go to Peter Zalmayev on that particular point.
Situation in Ukraine,
if I may go to Peter Zalmayev on this particular point, is there a misunderstanding of Russian intent, as we've heard there, that it has been treated as a second-class cousin in the community of nations, and this is its response? Is there any validity to that?
There has been, Russia has been very much aggrieved in the past decade or so with the Western sort of dismissal of its import and its role in international affairs. And recently it has been a crucial partner with the West in the talks about Iran and in the efforts underway to try to resolve the crisis in Syria. But the question is whether tanks in Ukraine, whether military presence in the breakaway republics of Georgia is really a way for Russia to assert its rightful place in international affairs. If the sanctions, if Western sanctions, whether they're forthcoming or not, have an effect or not, markets have already started to punish Russia. Yesterday morning, the Russian stock exchange opened to a precipitous decline in its index. The Russian ruble has been tumbling, reaching its all-time lows. So if it's not going to be sanctions, then the economy will hurt Russia, and I do not think it will be. It will contribute to its long-term goal to assert its rightful role in international affairs.
Well, let's just go to Ben Judah on that particular point. We're talking about sanctions. It's not clear exactly what proper sanctions are or will be applied. Yet what can be done? There has been an economic blowback in Russian markets, certainly we've heard about that, and yet there does appear to be no sense of concern in the Russian leadership about factors like this. They appear to be set on a course and will not be dissuaded by sanction or threat of sanction.
Well, as I've been trying to say throughout this programme, Putin knows that the Western European elites, this elite of financiers, this elite that fund political parties, this elite of which there is a revolving door with politics in Britain, France and Germany, is absolutely dependent on Russian investment continuing to come into London, Paris and Berlin, and has its own money in tax havens and is not going to kill the oligarch golden goose that feeds it. You know, Putin believes that the likelihood of Western sanctions is nil on the key banks that matter.
So,
what we've seen yesterday is stunning.
Sorry, can I just finish? Is that basically what is propping up Vladimir Putin is Western self-interest, particularly financial self-interest.
What I'm saying is that Western financial elites are partners in Russian corruption as long as they continue to help stolen money in Russia be extracted and placed securely in the West. Yesterday, there was a stunning report from The Guardian newspaper, in which was a photo of a position paper being taken within number 10 Downing Street, which was a response to John Kerry's mention that sanctions could be placed on Russia. And guess what was number 1 on the list of number 10's positions, which was no harm should be taken, no sanctions should be placed that harmed the interests of the City of London. Now, that's code for no harm on Putin's banks in London because British bankers make money for them. No harm on Russian oligarch property in London because London estate agents make money for them. That's code for no harm on the registering of Russia's state oil companies on the London Stock Exchange. London brokers make money for them. Those are the only things that can hurt Putin. Those are the only things that could stop him. And when Putin knows that the other points on the number 10 position papers were theatrical military manoeuvres at most somewhere within Europe, what's he got to be afraid of? Nothing.
Well, at that particular point, my thanks to our guests, Vyacheslav Matuzov, Ben Judah, and Peter Zalmayev. And why not join us in this discussion online? Leave us your thoughts and your comments at Facebook or Twitter. I'm Mike Hanna. Thank you for watching. Goodbye for now.